Vietnam is approximately 331,688 kilometers squared in area. The country is in the shape of an S. It is bordered by the South China Sea, China in the north, Laos and Cambodia in the northwest and southwest respectively. Famous cities and tourist attraction spots in Vietnam include the capital city Hanoi, which is up north, Ha Long Bay, Da Nang in the middle region, Nha Trang and Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon. As of 2014, Vietnam had a population of 90.7 million people, compared to the 1979 census, which showed a population of only 52.7 million people. The Vietnam flag has a five-pointed star, which symbolizes the five groups of workers in the building of socialism: intellectuals, peasants, soldiers, workers, and youths. The French colonial period between 1874 and 1954 saw European influences on Vietnamese culture, most notably the introduction of Catholicism, as well as influences on Vietnamese cuisine, for example, bread, pâté, consommé, and coffee. The 1975 Vietnam War between North and South provinces was a reason for migration. In April 1975, Saigon fell to the north. An estimated 2 million people fled Vietnam to countries such as Australia, USA, France, the UK, and Canada. Even though, with the lifting of trade sanctions by the USA in the 1990s, the country has seen income levels rise and food and other goods become available once more, it still has one of the highest malnutrition rates in Southeast Asia. According to the 2006 census, it was recorded that 159,850 Vietnamese-born people were living in Australia, and this grew to approximately 180,000 in 2011. There is predominantly more Vietnamese females compared to males. The main language spoken is Vietnamese, although there are different dialects and accents. Other languages spoken include Chinese or Cantonese, as well as French and English, and they still celebrate major festivals like Lunar New Year and Lantern Festival here in Australia.
The Vietnamese culture, like most other cultures, have factors that influence their eating habits. First is cultural factors. Food is very important to the Vietnamese community as it brings harmony and closeness between families. The Vietnamese pride themselves in shopping for and using fresh produce. However, they are more concerned about flavour, aromas, textures, and colours rather than nutrition. Vietnamese people also tend to not eat lamb. However, those living in Australia do eat lamb now due to acculturation. Religion also plays a role in the eating habits. Approximately 59% are Buddhists, 22% Catholic, 5% other religion, and 11% no religion. Buddhists fast for 3 days a month and some are vegetarian, whereas Catholics celebrate Easter and Christmas where they can indulge in a variety of meals and dishes. Those who are Catholic also go through a period of Lent, which is 40 days leading up to Easter, where they sacrifice something for 40 days, and some sacrifice certain foods. On Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, they have to follow a vegetarian diet and strictly eat 3 meals a day. Since Vietnam is a long, narrow country, they are influenced by many of their neighbouring countries. South Vietnam especially is heavily influenced by Cambodia and Thai cuisines, where they prefer sweet tastes by adding sugar and or coconut and more spicy flavours compared to the north. Most Vietnamese families grow their own rice either in their backyard or at their family farm. Rice is the main starch used in everyday meals and can also be used to make cakes and noodles. Because the Vietnamese are generally poorer, they can't afford machinery to plough their rice fields, so they make use of their pet buffaloes to do so. Buffaloes are great for Vietnamese farmers as they are well adapted to hot climates and their diet is easily maintained by eating grass. Celebrations are very important in Vietnam and they heavily influence eating habits. Vietnam and most other Asian countries such as China, Korea and Japan tend to follow the Lunar New Year calendar, so they celebrate Lunar New Year, which is the day between the 21st of January to 20th of February where there is a new moon, as well as the Lantern Festival, often falling during September or October. These two festivals are considered the biggest festivals during the year, and Vietnamese people often have large gatherings with family and friends where they cook feasts and indulge in hearty meals. Common foods consumed during these two celebrations are sticky rice cake, Vietnamese sausage, roast pork or duck, soups such as pho or bún bò Huế, pickled vegetables, crab, spring rolls, pork meatballs on skewers, beef wrapped in betel leaf, and especially during Lantern Festival they have desserts such as mooncakes and sticky rice cake dessert. Some traditional Vietnamese foods include pho, which is a beef noodle soup, and that consists of rice noodles, different cuts of beef, vegetables, and a sweet broth. The beef can also be substituted for chicken, and that is called chicken pho. The other beef noodle soup is called bún bò Huế, like pho, but it has a very strong pungent taste. The rice noodles, lots of beef, coagulated blood, and vegetables. There are also two seafood noodle soups. One is hủ tiếu, which consists of thin clear noodles, seafood broth, seafood, mince, pork or fish, sausage, and vegetables. The other is called bún riêu, which the broth is crab-based and can either have cuts of pork, beef, and or seafood, crab mince, fish cakes, and coagulated blood. On special occasions, families would also make this special noodle dish, which consists of extremely thin and woven noodles with roast pork or duck. Rice dishes are all very similar, and that consists of rice with meat and various vegetables, and sometimes can come with Vietnamese-style sausage and eggs. The Vietnamese also have their own type of omelette called bánh xèo, which has a crispy base and it's extremely thin like a crepe, and you can customize it with ground pork, prawn, vegetables, bean sprouts, and it's eaten with lettuce, herbs, and fish sauce. Another delicious meal is the rice paper roll. So it's a rice paper stuffed with noodles, pork, prawn, vegetables such as lettuce, cucumber, and mint, and there's usually a dipping sauce. Spring rolls are also very popular, and spring rolls is just a pastry on the outside stuffed with glass noodles, pork and or prawn, mushroom and carrots, and spring rolls are generally deep fried. At mealtimes, Vietnamese families gather together around the table or on the floor and they eat together. Everyone has an individual bowl of rice, chopsticks and a spoon to eat with. A typical day of eating would look like this. For breakfast, they would have a bowl of rice or noodles with meat or seafood, which can be fried, stir-fried, boiled, steamed or marinated or even stewed. Some will opt for bread or rice pudding, and some will have a cup of water, milk, tea or coffee. Lunch is very similar to breakfast, where they would have a bowl of rice or noodles with some sort of meat, vegetables, and if they're having soup with their rice, the soup will always be in a separate bowl and never in the same bowl as the rice. The Vietnamese generally don't have morning tea or afternoon tea like Australians do, but if they do have a tea break, they would usually have some sort of cake or a Vietnamese dessert such as sticky rice with coconut milk or a cup of tea or coffee. Dinner is the main meal of the day, so for dinner they usually have a larger portion of rice or noodles, or they can have a different type of meal such as the Vietnamese omelette or rice paper roll. But if it is a rice or noodle dish, it's the same as breakfast and lunch, so they would have it with meat or seafood, vegetables and soup.
For many young Vietnamese people in Australia, traditional Vietnamese food is associated with family time and more structured family traditions. Most young Vietnamese people eat traditional foods at home and eat typical Western food when out. This is partly for convenience. While in Vietnam many people still go home for lunch, this is not a common practice in Australia, nor is it practical. Also, eating in a more Western style is a way of engaging in an intercultural space. Many Vietnamese people, while still eating more traditional Vietnamese foods for their main meal, now choose Western foods for breakfast and lunch. Often this is for convenience and because these foods are more readily available than the traditional options. In researching this assignment, we were lucky enough to be able to interview a family member from one of the group who had arrived as a refugee from Vietnam more than 40 years ago. He told us that these days most foods are readily available in Australia, particularly with the rising number of Asian grocery and supermarkets, and that they were able to obtain all the traditional Asian foods and spices. Often it was just a matter of having enough money to be able to afford it, which is why a lot of Vietnamese families grow their own food, and this also helps to make it feel more like back at home. He said that Vietnamese people still prefer to eat as a family, but due to acculturation, eating together isn't usually convenient for most families, other than at weekends or special occasions. Vietnamese families in Australia tend to cook food and eat whenever it is convenient for them. For example, mum and the children might eat first and dad might eat when he gets home from work. As he said, most foods were readily accessible, so there were no need for alternatives, but there were things that he couldn't get when he first arrived, as he lived in a refugee camp where the variety of food was very limited. He remembers living off a lot of corn and didn't eat much rice or much Vietnamese food, as the cuisine wasn't well established in Australia. If you wanted Vietnamese food, you had to cook it and produce it for yourself. He says that Australia has changed the way they eat as they now eat more convenience food and often eat more takeaway, and it's more acceptable now to eat out, as families have busy lifestyles, which means they're often away from home and are forced to eat out.
Okay, so now we'll be looking at how the Vietnamese diet compares to the recommended Australian diet. So the traditional Vietnamese diet, like most Southeast Asian cuisines, has many significant health benefits. The Vietnamese diet is high in carbohydrates in the form of rice and noodles, which make up a large portion of most meals. They consist mostly of white rice and noodles, which is high in starch. Wholemeal selections are preferred by the Australian Dietary Guidelines as they contain more dietary fibre, vitamins and minerals than other more refined varieties. The Vietnamese diet is generally low in the kinds of cereal foods that are high in sugar and added saturated fat like cakes and other highly processed sweets. However, the French influence on the cuisine has introduced some pastries and high-starch breads. Coconut milk and cream are also used in desserts and sweet drinks. However, these aren't generally consumed in large amounts. The most popular cooking methods employed in Vietnamese cooking are poaching and steaming, which means the meals are generally low in saturated fats. Even when oil is used, it's generally only in the form of stir-frying, which still reduces the amount of fat consumed. This being said, in meals that do require more oil, traditionally Vietnamese cook with oils high in saturated fat, such as coconut oil. In terms of saturated fat, improvements could be made by reducing the skin left on cuts of meat and by consuming less fatty cuts of meat. For example, eating less cuts of pork that are high in fat, or chicken breast cuts rather than thigh cuts, which are usually preferred for flavour. A diet high in saturated fat increases the risk of heart disease. The Australian Dietary Guidelines encourage using monounsaturated or polyunsaturated varieties such as canola or sunflower oils. All these fats are high in kilojoules, so energy requirements should also be taken into consideration when evaluating the amount consumed. The Australian Dietary Guideline recommends a diet low in salt, as salt increases the risk of high blood pressure and may increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. While the Vietnamese diet would be considered quite healthy in most areas discussed in the guidelines, it may at times exceed the recommended intake for salt. This cuisine favours condiments usually high in sodium, such as fish sauce and black beans. For convenience, stock cubes are also commonly used for flavouring, as well as monosodium glutamate. While the Vietnamese diet is generally low in the consumption of processed foods, it does include some processed meat, such as Chinese sausage, which can be high in both saturated fats and salt. The Vietnamese diet includes a high consumption of fresh fruit and vegetables. The Australian Dietary Guideline recommends eating a diet high in fruits and vegetables, as they are relatively low in kilojoules and therefore may help protect against weight gain and its contribution to health risks. They are also high in soluble fibre and vitamins and minerals. The cuisine also includes a wide variety of vegetables, all consumed seasonally. Pickled and fermented vegetables can contribute to the overall salt consumption of the diet, and according to the guidelines can contribute to some cancers, so the consumption of these should be limited. As the cuisine is relatively low in dairy products compared with the recommended intake suggested in the guidelines, it is possible that the diet does not include enough of these foods. Dairy products can help protect us against heart disease and stroke. It can also contribute to strong, healthy bones and reduce the risk of diabetes, cancer, and high blood pressure. The Vietnamese diet somewhat makes up for this shortfall by their increased consumption of green leafy vegetables and tofu, so this helps address some of those dietary needs.